Emerging Young Scholars Research. We have Sophia Town from Arizona State, and we have Jared, from the University of Utah. And we have, as our discussants, Sandra Waddock, the Galligan Chair of Strategy in the Carroll School, scholar of corporate responsibility at Boston College, author of several books and very well known at the Academy and in the business and society field. And Manuel Guillen at the University of Valencia representative at RCC, Harvard University, and the director of the Institute for Ethics and Communication in Organizations. They will be leading our discussion today. Before we start into the presentations, I wanted to turn over to Michael Pirson, the leader of the EMA group, and just have him say hello to all of you.
Hello. So thanks, David, for doing this. Thanks, Sandra, for being on. Thank you all for joining, Manuel, Jared, Sophia, and everybody else. And this is an effort that we started last year because there seems to be some need for younger students in some way in that field, not younger, but by age, but sort of those that are exploring the field, to get some more support and help, especially with the kind of topics that we're sort of broaching through the lens of humanistic management. And so this has been a nice format that has been growing. And so what we're doing is sort of basically an invitation. This can be developed further in many different ways. We're hoping that we can build a community online, so to speak, but also then offline, and foster collaboration, support, potential publication outlets. We have a number of companies that want to work with us that we can potentially connect some of you with. And so there is ample opportunity. And so for those of you that want to be engaged, please feel free to think about that. I'll turn it back over to David, who, and I just want to mention that again, Duquesne University and his center have generously accepted to sponsor this series. And so, David, thanks.
Oh, God, it's my pleasure. I think this is a very good network and a great way to help doctoral students and young scholars along. What I'd like to do here today, we'll hear from Sophia Town first and then Jared Poole next. We'll do a 15-minute presentation and then question and answer discussion after each presentation. And then I'd like to have a few minutes just at the end to talk about some other initiatives I'd like to launch for this PhD network for humanistic management and get some of your feedback on that. So if you're ready, Sophia, may I turn it over to you?
Hi, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you fine. Good morning.
Okay. Perfect. Good morning. Well, thank you so much for having me, for hosting me on here. I am absolutely honored to be here as a junior scholar coming into the field, and as someone very interested in humanistic management. I have to say I'm incredibly grateful to have all of these scholars and students and just people who are passionate about this topic on here on this call today. So thank you for inviting me. Thank you for being here. And I'm excited to kind of share what I'm up to and get some feedback and comments and questions and all of that. So my name is Sophia Town, as David mentioned. I am a fourth-year PhD at Arizona State, and my whole jam is leadership. That's what I'm interested in. Co-elevating leadership, empathic leadership, and now I can use this term humanistic leadership, which I'm going to eagerly adopt. So that's what I'm up to. And then my dissertation is looking at sort of a little sliver of that, a little sliver of leadership. So I guess I'm going to screen share my presentation if that works for you guys here. Let's see. I haven't done this before on Zoom, so bear with me just 1 second. Okay.
There you go.
Okay, so I think, are you able to see this as a presentation now? Let's see.
Yes.
You can see it? Okay, fantastic. Okay, so my dissertation is tentatively titled, Why Leaders Can Slow Down to Speed Up. And it's an exploration of mindfulness-based paradox management logics. So basically what that means is that I'm developing, my goal is to develop a model for teaching leaders how to manage organizational paradoxes that arise in their organizations. And to do this, I'm doing in-depth qualitative interviews of the way that leaders' language may influence their ability to manage paradox. So I take a constitutive view where I'm looking at communication as constitutive of leadership and organizing in relation to paradox management. And I'm not only looking at the way that leaders specifically can navigate seeming paradox in their organizations, but how they can empower their followers to do the same. I think that's one of the most important parts of leadership, is the ability to influence on a larger scale and empower your employees. And so this research extends paradox management logics by looking at the way that leaders who actually practice mindfulness talk about paradox. And I'll get into why I'm looking at mindfulness practitioners in just a second. So organizations are full of seeming paradox. Paradoxes occur when two or more things that appear to be contradictory both need to happen for the health of the organization. And you can probably start thinking about in your own life, many times you've seen this shown up in your organizations. Organizationally, it causes a host of problems. So it can cause decoupling, it can cause organizational paralysis or gridlock when companies don't know what to do, how to choose between sort of these seeming incommensurable poles or tensions. And then obviously after too many instances of decoupling or gridlock, it's going to lead to loss of reputation, resources, time. Individually, for the employees involved, it can lead to literalism, so a lack of complex thinking. It can lead to overthinking, it can lead to paranoia, withdrawal, guilt, anxiety, eventual inertia. So when people are faced with seeming incommensurable tensions, they don't know what to do, can cause a host of organizational and individual problems for employees. The good news is that leaders can help this problem because of their hierarchical status and ability to influence their employees on a large scale through organizational messaging. Leaders can dissolve illusions of paradox. I'll say why they're illusions in just a minute, but they can dissolve illusions of paradox through effective message framing, or sense giving. And everybody in the organization actually potentially has this capacity, but leaders are in a unique position to do so because of their ability to reach the organizational audience. And this is important because the way that people perceive of tensions, so either as paradoxical and knotted and unmanageable, or as maybe dialectical and generative and synergistic, the way people perceive of the tension influences their ability to cope or to manage or to navigate or even transcend. So it influences their ability to respond. And the three kind of modes of responses that I'm using in my dissertation as a framework are Putnam and colleagues. They did this really great literature review, synthesized literature review of all the different ways that kind of we talk about paradox management, paradox responses. And the three that I'm using are the either-or model, the both-and model, or the new more-than model. So the either-or model basically says when a leader or an employee is faced with a paradox, a seeming paradox, they don't know what to do, they have to choose one pole over the other. And as you can imagine, that leads to things like decoupling and like loss of decreased morale because there's this choice happening. It often can lead to power struggles or defense mechanisms. Then there's the both-and model, which is more productive, more generative. In this model, when faced with a contradiction, a leader or employee might say, okay, you know what, we can actually accomplish both of these things. It takes more cognitive complexity, it takes more time, but it's more productive overall. And then the third approach that I'm looking at is this more than approach. And the more than approach essentially says, look, here are these tensions. They might seem contradictory at first blush, but actually when we introduce them together, there's an outcome that's more synergistic and more generative than either pole or any of the poles in isolation. So sort of the whole is more than the sum of its parts. This takes a lot more time, a lot more cognitive complexity, and some critical thinking and creative problem-solving skills. But this is the approach that I want to get at. How do we extend this more than model? So this is all great. Leaders can help. We have these different responses. Some leaders are really wonderful at managing seeming paradox. The issue, or the interesting thing, is that we actually don't know a lot about how to teach leaders to do this. So we don't really have a pedagogy of paradox management, so to speak. And that's where I'm hoping to contribute. So how am I doing this? I'm looking first at leaders' language. As I mentioned, I take a communicatively constitutive view of leadership and organizing. So I'm looking at the way that communication influences our ability to think about paradox. So my first research question is, in what ways does leaders' communication about paradox reflect, enable, or constrain their ability to navigate seeming contradictions in their organization? And to do that, I'm looking at leaders who practice mindfulness. So research shows that mindfulness promotes paradoxical thinking by allowing for uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity, and for helping individuals learn how to hold seeming contradictions in this generative tension with one another without becoming cognitively overburdened by them. And so when I say mindfulness, I'm mostly talking about meditation, but there are also cognitive exercises that people can use that also promote paradoxical thinking. Research shows that people who formally practice mindfulness tend to recognize contradictions as dynamic and commensurable and then move through them accordingly. People who practice mindfulness also are learned in and practiced in employing a beginner's mind. So bracketing preconceived notions and mental frameworks for how the world works in order to perceive more creative or novel solutions. And then mindful leadership has also been linked with increased role modeling behaviors. So why that's important to me is, again, I'm looking at the way that leaders not only manage paradox, but can empower their followers to do the same. So my research questions here are, in what ways do leaders who practice mindfulness navigate seeming or organizational paradox? In what ways do leaders who practice mindfulness talk about seeming organizational paradox? Because again, I use the view that we think in language. And then in what ways, if at all, do leaders who practice mindfulness actually empower their followers to do the same? Empower their followers to navigate paradox as well. My theoretical framework is vast, so I'm not going to get into all of these one-on-one, but I'm just kind of showing here what I'm using. Paradox framework, paradox theory, paradoxical leadership, the constitutive view of paradox, which says that paradox is constituted in language, discursive leadership, which is the idea that leadership emerges through language, through communication and social interaction and discourse. I'm also looking at Western socio-cognitive mindfulness, which focuses more on our cognitive complexity, and Eastern mindfulness, Buddhist mindfulness, which focuses a little bit more on emotional regulation and emotional complexity. And then mindful organizing, which looks at day-to-day practices that promote, engage, and reflect mindfulness. Also organizational mindfulness, which looks at the way that mindfulness can be embedded in practices based on sort of these micro discourses. And then mindful leadership. My methods, this is a qualitative study, so I'm doing in-depth interviews. So far to date, I've interviewed 31 leaders. I should tell you about my participants. They're leaders in organizations who have a personal mindfulness practice. So I've interviewed 31 people to date. Part of my recruitment, I've had each individual complete 3 reliable mindfulness scales. So the mindful attention and awareness scale, the 5-facet mindfulness questionnaire, and then the cognitive and effective mindfulness scale to see if they score high in mindfulness. And I actually haven't analyzed those yet, so we should see. Hopefully they will, but if not, that'd be interesting in and of itself. And then my in-depth interviews are respondent interviews. They're each an hour long, and they're meant to galvanize discussion and collaborative meaning. I'm looking for rich narrative data. I'm focusing in on conceptual metaphors because I believe metaphors reflect thinking. And then looking at how participants engage in sense-making. And I've found that some of these interviews have actually sort of encouraged sense-making along the way. My analysis so far, I haven't formally coded any of my data, so what I'll share with you in a minute, my sort of preliminary findings is all based on this frenetic iterative analysis. So my iterative analysis, I've been doing, taking analytic memos, and I have a dissertation diary, and it's been very much sort of this iterative process as I've been going through my interviews and analyzing them informally along the way. I'm really excited to start my formal analysis and coding and all of that, which is just around the corner. So I'm hoping that at the end of this to put together a typology for a pedagogy of paradox. So what are different ways in language that we can respond to paradox? That's my end goal with my analysis. Okay, so the fun part, preliminary findings. So what I have found so far in my 31 interviews is overwhelmingly participants have talked about this pause, which if you know anything about mindfulness won't surprise you. But if you know anything about paradox literature, it might surprise you a little bit, because this isn't talked about very much in the paradox literature. It's in there, but it's not really unpacked in a substantive way. So I'm kind of excited about this finding. My participants have talked a lot about taking this pause. So where paradox often is, we think of inaction or inertia or paralysis as incredibly problematic, my participants have given themselves permission to stop. And so they're using this inaction in a purposeful way. They're not sort of thrown into inaction because it's the only option that they see, which is what we see in the paradox literature often. So this pause is sort of this umbrella, and within that pause, they've given themselves permission to step back. They've collected more data. They've sought out diverse opinions, sometimes as a protocol, sometimes as like a weekly meeting where they're seeking out diverse opinions, and they have these boards full of individuals who have very specialized skill sets. They've taken the pause to regulate their emotion and de-escalate anxiety. They've used the pause to do some perspective taking. And then they also use the pause to sort of remind themselves and their employees about the arbitrariness of deadlines, how deadlines are self-imposed. And so my example interview question that often prompts this pause response is, can you tell me—
sorry, maybe 2 minutes, just
okay.
for time considerations, apologize.
Oh, thank you. So, well then, you know what, I won't read their quotes. You can kind of see those on there, but so this pause. So my question here is, how might this pause complicate or extend current paradox management frameworks? The next finding is be unselfishly selfish, which I think is kind of fun because it sounds like a paradox, but they've talked very often about engaging in self-care, or asking for help when needed, or taking time each day to meditate, or prioritizing me time. So the quote that I think is most illuminating is, put on your own mask first. How might this complicate or extend current models of others-centered leadership? Others-centered leadership doesn't talk a whole lot about care for self. So this is something I'm interested in exploring a little bit further. And then the last preliminary finding is language-based, which is something I'm interested in, is use inviting language. So I've asked them, as you know, can you think of a time when you've used language that seems to trigger mindfulness in yourself or others? Is that even possible? And they've said, use language that brings people into an open space, or brings in invitations to bring curiosity. And how might this extend leadership theory? Something I'm interested in. And then I'll show you here, this is very tentative and very rough, but as I'm working with some of these preliminary findings, I have kind of the beginnings of potentially a conceptual model. So toward a pedagogy of paradox, what I'm seeing, and these arrows show sort of a flow. This is not a theorized, done model yet by any stretch, but these arrows show a flow. So the leader encounters this seeming paradox. Then they give themselves permission to take this pause. They communicate the pause to others. They invite their employees to sit with the discomfort and uncertainty. There's some emotional regulation and de-escalation of anxiety taking place there. Then there's this awareness of neutral or positive emotions, so a shift from negative to positive emotions. I've seen that a lot in my interviews. Then they're experiencing this curiosity or optimism about the future. They're data gathering, they're collecting diverse opinions, And then what's eventually seeming to happen, often, not always, is this identifying of creative possibilities or seeing novel solutions, which reflects this both and more than approach. So this is the conceptual model I'm sort of working toward. Again, I'm excited to code and analyze my data formally, and hopefully I'll get more detail into what this looks like in their lives. But that's it for now. So questions, comments, feedback.
Thank you so much, Sophia. Apologize with our time constraints because if you check the chat, there's some interest in your work. Actually, people that are doing similar research too.
Awesome.
Marianne would like to connect with you, and her dissertation is also on mindfulness. And we do have a couple questions from the audience, but I'd like to turn it to our discussants first and get their initial reactions and possible questions for you. So, Sandra, would you mind?
Yes. Hi, Sophia. That was great. I'm really interested in your work, and I think you're doing a really interesting study here. So I urge you to keep going. I think you need a couple things that come to me right away that I think you need to think about. And one is the link between the research questions that you laid out at the beginning and where you seem to be going with your findings, because there seems to be a gap there. So I'm not quite sure how this model that you're developing answers the particular questions that you laid out in the beginning. And the other thing that I think possibly reviewers will ask you is, well, yeah, it's very nice that people who have mindfulness practices do these things. What about people who don't have mindfulness practices? So I'm wondering if you thought about interviewing some subset of people maybe who don't have mindfulness practices to see if they follow the same kinds of strategies. I realize that would add more interviews, but those are just two things that occur to me, just to sort of make sure that you don't run into problems with reviewers as you try to publish this work later on. But I think it's amazing work and very interesting. So,
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I had not thought about your first comment, and I'm going to go look at that when we get off this call. I think that's really important. I start with these research questions. Then if I end somewhere else, if it's a qualitative study, maybe I can kind of iteratively adjust some of those research questions.
Yes, I mean that's what happens with qualitative research. Actually, it is an iterative process, and you may be finding something different than what you thought you were going to find initially.
Right.
But it's also not entirely clear. I'm trying to where your questions here. How do they manage organizational paradox? You're not really asking them, from what I can see at least, about how they manage organizational paradox. You are asking them how they talk about it. You're not really asking them how they empower their followers. At least I didn't hear you asking them that. So those are research questions you just may want to drop.
Got it.
Just be very careful that you don't end up with data in search of questions, which is a terrible place to end up.
Right. So I love this idea about interviewing others who are not mindfulness practitioners. I also think that they probably there's more data, but they'd probably be a lot easier to find leaders who aren't mindfulness practitioners, because
absolutely, yes. And at least having some, so that when a reviewer says, well, yeah, but here's a nice model, and you say it applies to these people with mindfulness practices, but maybe everybody does that. So
got it.
At least have some data to show the reviewers that nah, everybody doesn't do that. So, Manuel, I don't know who else is commenting here. So,
yeah, Manuel, you have the floor.
Hello? You're muted.
Yeah. So. Sorry, I was just saying, can you hear me well now? Is it working? So I was saying, congratulations, Sophia. I agree with Sandra. This is a really nice topic, and I think it's really relevant. And I also agree, it's funny because I was thinking almost the same kind of thing. Sandra was making this comment, in the sense that I think there's an intuition there in your mind and in your work that is great, like the connection of things. And this, you can see that reflection on the research questions. Like the how is the connection between the way you use mindfulness and the manage of the paradox and the way you talk about that. But what I say is that you need to go a step backward and say, okay, what is this study for? So you really found that understanding the paradox is important for organizations. So you first need to explain that, well, why is this relevant for organizations? And then you have a reason why your study is relevant. And then when you explain why your study is relevant in terms of results, of solving problems that are practical and real in real life, then you will understand better the connection of the cause that is producing that effect that you want to explain. And of course, you need what Sandra was saying. Why is this causing that and not people not having mindfulness approach? So you will be able to prove that there is a different result, but there is a relationship between cause and effect. And I didn't see that in your study. In fact, you were talking about teaching approach and pedagogical approach. Why is this in the context of teaching? I guess before teaching something, you really need to understand what's going on. And I think this is exactly what you're doing, trying to understand to later explain that. But I say to many places here, you want to connect. It's probably, now that you already have interviews, you may think deeply, what is this explaining and how is this helping organizations to manage in a better way or to solve better problems, and focus on that. And from there, you will find research questions. And then I will move forward again. But if not, it's like, I've got a research question, I check them, and I prove them in a model. So what?
Yeah, got it.
So I think you need to, because now you know the reality and you were studying the reality, just think about how is this helping to an organization? Or how can I prove that a mindful approach, a mindfulness approach is going to solve better this problem or faster or whatever. But you have to prove something. And this is what is bringing you the research question. I couldn't see that yet. I see the intuition, and it's a good intuition. I love this field. I think you're in a great area. But I still see that you need to really say, how is this affecting to the organization? And why is this relevant to be published in a journal or to be taught in a master program, for example? You need to, right? I think, Sandra, go ahead.
Yeah, if I could just, I agree with you, Manolo. That's really helpful, I think. I suggested in the chat box that maybe you look at some of Maurizio Zollo's work on neurological shifts that occur when people meditate, because in a sense, he's looking at doing controlled experiments and looking at the brain shifts that happen. But it's also relates to your question about pedagogy. But what I think what Manolo is pointing out is that in qualitative work like this, you're asking them a certain set of questions, and in a sense, you're letting the data tell you what the research question is. So you don't come into it with a set of hypotheses as you would in more quantitative research. You're coming at it with these questions that you're asking. You're saying, okay, you're basically asking, how do you think about paradox when you are doing this? When you are doing this, and what is the impact of doing that on you as a leader or a manager? And I think right now with the data that you have, that's the kind of question you can be asking. Not the questions about like empowering workers and stuff. You can ask them what they do about that, but how? I didn't hear you asking that question. So you're asking them how they respond and what this mindfulness practice enables them to do that they might not have been able to do without it.
Got it. Yes. Okay.
It's important. The thing that Maurizio's work is showing is that gray matter actually shifts. I don't think he's even published this, but it actually shifts for the better when people start to meditate. So there's, as you pointed out at the start of your talk, there's a lot of research that suggests important personal implications. And here you're talking about paradox and the ability to assess paradox, and what you're looking at is a process that people use to deal with situations of ambiguity, tension, paradox, problematic situations from their personal leadership perspective. And that's really important. Really interesting.
I'm going to have to step in there so we can give Jared Poole an opportunity to present his research and get some feedback too. Unfortunately, we don't have more time. There's a real great deal of interest in your topic, Sophia. Please check the chat. And to the audience, I encourage you to post questions and ask you for your comments to Sophia directly on the chat. And we can continue this conversation offline. And certainly we'll be getting together throughout the next many months. So there'll be more opportunities for feedback and conversation. So due to our timetable here, I'd like to turn it over to Jared Poole from the University of Utah to present his research next. So thank you very much for leading us off, Sophia. It was absolutely wonderful. And I have some comments myself.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Sophia. And I'll also just second everything you said off the top about being grateful for being here. This is a really awesome opportunity to present, and I appreciate the work you all, David and Michael, did to set this up. And shout out Elizabeth Luckman, who connected me with you all at MSR this year. I'm not sure if she's here, but hi. Anyway, okay, so I'm a doctoral student at the University of Utah in the OB group. I'm presenting today some it's a theory paper basically that came out of some, it's part of my dissertation proposal, parts of other projects that I've been working on. And I can't do two things at once, so I'm gonna go silent while I put this presentation up. Can you all see that?
There we go. There you go.
Okay.
Perfect.
Okay, so you can see from the title, we're going to be talking about racial and religious identity, what I'm calling racialized religious logics in organizations. I'm getting ready to send this off to some conferences, so looking forward to trying out these ideas on you today. Okay, I have to click the screen. So a quick literature review. We all know diversity and inequality research. There's a lot of it, but some recent reviews have highlighted the need to look closer at the role that process and context plays, both in the effectiveness of diversity programs and also the effect of diversity on performance. That relationship is something that we actually don't know a ton about just yet. As also this group is probably well aware, there's very little mainstream research in OB, OT, or management that looks at the role of religion in organizations. There's a great review just a couple of years ago in Academic Management Annals that highlighted this. And then finally, the institutional logics perspective has been advanced recently as a hopeful successor to neo-institutionalism. The advantage of institutional logics is supposed to be that it helps us look closer at the role of societal context, so looking at the societal level, how organizations fit into societal logics, and also taking seriously the possibility of heterogeneity as opposed to just assuming that, isomorphism, the tendency to conform in kind of unthinking ways, it is not always the most pervasive effect of institutions. So with that kind of background, I'll couch my research question in that, and it's just how I want to know, how do racialized religious logics affect organizational diversity and inequality? So my goals for the project are to advance management, spirituality, and religion research by showing how it can connect to more to the mainstream of management research by looking at it through the lens of institutional logics. I also want to advance diversity and equality research by attending to process and context, and also advance institutional logics research by applying it to diversity and inequality research. So one of the places where neo-institutionalism has been the most successful, I think, in OT is explaining organizational inequality, racial and gender inequality, occupational segregation and stuff. And so for institutional logics to kind of take the throne or something like that, it should probably do at least as good of a job at explaining that, some of those important findings. And so 2 and 3 are really similar. So I'm going to call them 2A and 2B. Basically, I just want to apply logics to diversity research. That's about it. So the roadmap for today, I'm going to touch briefly on the logics perspective, briefly explain why I think that race operates by a kind of community logic, explain why racialized logics are, religious logics are racialized in the United States, and then touch for a second on a couple of processes that I think, through which I think logics affect diversity and inequality in organizations. Okay, so the logics perspective, its advantages are supposed to be its ability to think about the duality of symbolic and material aspects of institutions, so the duality of both meaning and material practices, how those both constitute institutions. The ability to theorize both homogeneity and heterogeneity. Also important for understanding what the institutional logic perspective hopes to, or how, essentially how it works. There's a handful of what are called institutional orders that have different elements, and I'll show it briefly in a second. And the idea is that the key to understanding change and stability in institutions is to see how these different orders interact. So this is my awesome photocopy from my book of the institutional orders across the top and then the elements down the left-hand side. What we're going to be focused on are columns 2 and 3 mostly, so I'm going to talk about the intersection of community and religious logics. And on that note, like, what are community logics and what do they have to do with race? So I'm defining community kind of broadly as just an association of people who are linked by, okay, I guess I'll approve that. I'm not sure what I just did. Association of people linked by common interests, and it's not necessarily geographic. That's really important for my argument. Couple reviews there that show the strong influence that communities have on organizations. A lot of MSR research is actually kind of in that vein. Communities operate on the basis of trust and reciprocity. Just mere membership in the group is sort of enough to be identified with the group and be subject to its norms and rituals, that sort of thing. The goal is to increase the status of the group. And what does it have to do with race? Oh, I didn't do that. I think somebody else did that, and that's okay. But I just want to say briefly that, so the connection to race is first of all, linguistic. I like Sophia's emphasis on language, because I think just the language we use, the Black community, the white community, that really indicates that these are not just social identities to us. It's about belonging to a group and having responsibilities to the group, and then operating on the basis of certain group norms with other groups. But also, so some research has shown that race as a highly visible surface level characteristic contributes to automatic sense making, which is important. I'm not doing any of that. Okay, so I think I shared my PowerPoint with somebody, and I appreciate like their eagerness to look at it. But I'm gonna just keep going back to the slide that I'm on. That's not a problem. So anyway, yeah, race is important, and that's all I need to say about that, I guess. Oh, there it goes again. Okay, so, okay, I think I can, oops. Okay. Sorry, I unshared whatever was going on there. And, okay, sorry about all that. This is also my first time on Zoom. So, okay, so also religious logics are racialized in the United States. A lot of my argument centers around the role of history in setting that up. And just today, there's a lot of great research on how religious identity or affiliation is not the only predictor of a lot of important moral, political beliefs about race and racism, but it's really the intersection of race and religion that is really predictive. Okay, so to recap, first I said race operates by a community logic. Second, I said that religious logics are racialized in the United States. Taken together, that basically means that religious logics are infused with a racial community logic in the United States. So processes affecting inequality and diversity and inequality in organizations from an institutional logics perspective, I think going up the levels, micro, meso, macro, we're going to be operating primarily through workplace relationships, then through organizational identity, and finally, I think you'll find some interesting regional effects. So workplace relationships. So Weaver and Agel have a really great AMR about how religious identity might shape ethical behavior in the workplace. And I like their discussion of how the presence of co-religionists can influence the salience of racial identity or religious identity. Also, LMX theory really emphasizes relationships in the workplace, particular manager-employee, but we can think other relationships will also matter. And finally, in the sociology of religion, cross-race relationships have shown to influence, in some circumstances, the way that whites think about race and racism. So I think relationships will be very important. Second, organizational identity. This is the key mechanism for Thornton et al., who promulgated institutional logics in its fullest form. The key mechanism for societal logics to affect organizations. It runs through organizational identity and practices that exist in the organization. So that's going to be an important place for researchers to look. Also, diversity and inequality researchers have found some founding effects for organizations. So for instance, organizations founded before the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 had sometimes had some difficulty catching up with the times compared to organizations who were founded later, where the norm of like HR professionals was more institutionalized. Okay, and finally, some regional effects. I've said non-geographic communities are really important for organizations. Also, geographic communities are important for organizations. There's been some really interesting research in the finance and accounting literature, and that's obviously not my field, so I don't know how robust the findings are, but finding things like firms located in areas with that are highly religious or something are more risk averse. They have fewer accounting irregularities. I think there was a study done in China that firms located near more monasteries or something like that appeared to have less earnings management. So that seems inconvenient for rational choice theory. So those findings might be sort of contentious in the field. But anyway, I think it's provocative and perhaps promising for the argument. Obviously, we found a lot of isomorphic regional effects in inequality research, looking at how firms in the same industry or in the same region as a successful discrimination lawsuit start to behave in the same way by pushing women and minorities into higher levels of management or whatever. And finally, American faiths are really regionally segregated. I don't think I had time to highlight this, but churches are the most segregated.
3 minutes left, if you could. Sorry.
Yeah, thanks, David. Churches are some of the most segregated institutions in society. One place I read that churches are more segregated than the neighborhoods that they're located in. They're more segregated than public schools. So people like go out of their way, not always intentionally, to worship with people who are more like them in various by various social identifiers. So because of that regional segregation on the basis of religion, I think that we'll find pretty strong regional effects on diversity and inequality running through these racialized religious logics. Okay, so by way of conclusion, I'll go back to my goals here, and you can kind of judge for yourself how promising the argument is. So I've tried to show that MSR research can connect to the mainstream of management research through institutional logics, and specifically looking at racialized religious logics. I think that allows us to preserve our humanistic and emancipatory edge by looking at these issues in a different way than the mainstream maybe, while also being engaged in those conversations. And then second, I've argued that given the presence of racialized religious logics, which we think exist on the basis of history, language, and recent findings about differences in religious belief based on race, the effect of these logics on diversity and inequality run through workplace relationships, organizational identity, and regional effects. And I don't have a nice questions and comments slide like Sophia did, but that's the end. So thanks.
Thanks very much, Jared. That's very interesting work. I think I encourage everyone to post some questions and comments in the chat. But in the meantime, I will turn back over to Sandra and Manuel. I'd like to leave just 2 or 3 minutes at the end to make a couple of announcements for future PhD network. But in the meantime, turn it over to
Manuel, would you like to go first, since I went first last time? Manuel, do you want to go first? You have to unmute.
Manuel, you're muted.
Sorry, Sandra, yeah, go first. So I guess that in this case, the thesis, the PhD is much more still in the stage of a project, I guess, because what I found here is a more theoretical proposal of how radicalized religious logic impact organizations. So I guess this is more like trying to connect different institutional logics. So I again, like in the previous comment I was asking, I need a kind of an external logic for the main question here, which is, what are you trying to understand? Which the MSR research can connect with mainstream research and institutional logic sounds okay, but I don't see that as enough kind of research question. I don't see that as a justifying PhD project in itself. You need to really say, why is this relevant to the real world of business, or specifically in the US, you think this is specifically relevant in the US. So I found I still need to understand better why the research question, why this one and no other. And then the second thing is why these approaches, community logic, radicalized religious logics, why these and not others? Why are you just not presenting? I mean, in radical choice theory, you can find many other options. So why this specific? Is this something that you found, or is there an intuition? As Sandra was saying before, in qualitative research, this is not even qualitative. I think it's much more theoretical still. But you don't try to, you're just trying to discover things that have not been discovered before. But you need to get connections and causality there. Why is this connected with this? So I guess I still didn't get, why are you studying this problem? Why are you connecting these specific approaches? And I think you know that. So I need that as the first step for the explanation of the entire project. So I think that would be very relevant to explain first, why is this problem relevant for the US organizations and humanistic management approach? And then go to the why these specific logics and perspectives, like community and race, why are you connecting them? You found the literature, but I need to get the why are you connecting them for the research project for your purpose. So again, I'm missing a little bit which one is the final purpose. Sandra, I don't know if you're here.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Manuel. I fundamentally agree with what you just asked. So I would say to you, Jared, tell me an instance in which this, give me a story here. So an argument, you need to make an argument that links these things. You're asking a lot of questions, and you've certainly reviewed a lot of literature, and certainly the topic of race and racialized religious experience in the workplace might be important. But I agree with Manuel. I don't see what your story here is, and I see that you've covered a lot of literature, but I don't see what the argument. An argument flows logically from one statement to the next and each one builds on each other. So I would like to ask you, give me an example. Tell me the phenomenon that you observed that made you interested in this issue. So give that example so that people know what you're talking about, because you're using a lot of technical jargon here, a lot of technical terms, and a lot of literature that have different kinds of findings, but there's no kind of coherent story at the core of it yet. I think Manuel's right. You observed something that made you aware of this and interested in this phenomenon. What is that? Give the example so that people can say, oh, okay, now I see why he's looking at all of this different literature and what the relevance of that literature is. And I see what the argument underlying this is. There's a phenomenon here. It's got to be, in my view, all of our research has to be about something more than finding some sort of little gap in the literature. To me, that's just crap. Sorry for the language, but we don't want to be doing that. We want to look at some phenomenon that's important. And, so there is something that brought you to this. What is it? Tell us that story. That sets the context for then bringing in the relevant literature that you've looked at. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, definitely.
And that's basically what Manuel was asking you to do too. Okay,
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I've 100% spent less time on that part than the lit review and stuff. But so this came out of my dissertation, which is looking at how racial and religious identities construct moral identities, and I'm doing that. It's a qualitative study in the Christian hip-hop industry, and that was basically because two of my friends from undergrad are Christian rappers, and I was like, they're really smart. I'm like, why are you doing this and not making more money on something easier and stuff? And it's because they're Black Christian men that makes that career path make any sense at all. And then I went to the literature, and there's no way of making sense of that in the literature. And so that's what kicked off the dissertation and stuff. So I guess I could have started with something like that to contextualize the whole discussion and stuff. But
yeah, and then even as you're trying to contextualize it, only the literature that supports your argument is relevant. You don't need to bring everything you've ever read into this paper. It's the literature that helps you create the story, the art. Basically we are storytellers as scholars, and we have to be conveying to our audience, whether that's in presentation or in an article or a book or whatever we're writing, we're conveying that story. So it needs to be clear and logical and supported by the evidence in some way. And so you have the pieces there, but they're kind of all hanging out there at this point, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree with Sandra, and I would add something more, which is, in terms of the literature, it should be relevant for your phenomenon, what you're studying, but also could prove the opposite of what you thought was the phenomenon explanation. You need to be honest. So you really want to really understand something in the reality that you don't understand and want to explain to others through a theoretical approach. And that theoretical approach may explain something totally different from what you thought. This is an honest and ethical research. You're trying to prove something and maybe you find something else. But the relevance of the theory is not every aspect of different theories, but those aspects are part of the theories that can help to understand your problem. I think, but I got that you have that phenomenon and you have the reason why. So this is the main thing. I'm very happy to hear that. So now is a lot of work, and Sandra is saying, to connect those pieces with the real problem and then trying to explain the connection. And then it will be a very relevant work. And it makes sense even if you're not making money out of this. Yeah, congratulations, by the way. I think it's a good point.
Yeah, thanks. That makes a lot of sense. I'm a big advocate for stories. So thanks for that feedback.
You're welcome.
Okay. Thank you, Manuel. Thank you, Sandra. Jared, thanks. I hope this feedback is very useful to you as well as for you, Sophia. Again, please check the chat room there. There are some additional questions and comments directed to both of you. I would like to just wrap up with a couple announcements and thoughts about the future of this PhD network, since we are sponsoring it here at Duquesne. Our next one will be Monday, November 5th at 10 o'clock Eastern Time. I think that's after the clocks change, so it'll be Eastern Standard Time. And at the moment, we have Celeste Diaz-Ferraro from Penn State University scheduled to speak, and we're working on securing the second speaker. So one shout out to all the doctoral students on this Zoom call. We are looking for volunteers for anyone that would like to get feedback on this, on your research, on maybe specific aspects of your research, a little bit more focused on a particular question or problem that you're having, so you can get feedback from some of our discussants. And we're trying to build this network for the benefit of you. So anyone that you can spread the word to about humanistic management and EMA and this PhD network would be very useful to us. So we're only as strong as your network is, so please spread the word and tell them that we are doing these things. And in a moment, I'm going to turn to Michael to talk about another recurring event that we have with the Humanistic Management Association. I encourage you to send me, and I'll put my, I think you have it on the Eventbrite, but put my email on the chat. Send me suggestions for topics, for other ways that we can build this network. We're looking to expand away from just the doctoral student presentations in this particular format. We're looking to do other things. I've gotten feedback, actually got some feedback from Sophia on this and some other doctoral students already. We, one of the things that we're gonna do is we're gonna have sort of a career development workshop led by some senior scholars in the field that can talk about certain issues like going on the job market and what kinds of things to expect at the next stage of your career. So sort of a career development workshop series, as well as I'd like to have a research open forum that encourages people to come with their research interests, just for an open brainstorming networking opportunity. Unfortunately, there were originally almost 40 people on this call. We didn't get to introduce everyone. So if we just had a session that wasn't focused on one particular person, but a session that everyone could share what they're working on, that would also build the network up, I think. And another suggestion that I have to develop a little bit more, but I like it a lot, are little mini webinars on specific topics that would help doctoral students, like theory building or writing in general, and doing a thorough lit review, or something on qualitative research. Get an expert in the field to talk about it and have the students take the floor and ask questions of the expert on things that they're concerned about, just in general, not on their particular topic. So these are some of the things that we're going to be working on here in the future. So this network, I want to continue to grow. It's doing very well. And thanks to you and your presentations and the fine scholars that we have being discussants, I think this is a great success. So thank you all again. Michael, in the last minute, do you want to say something about the necessary conversations?
Sure. Well, there are all kinds of formats that we're putting on at the International Humanistic Management Association. If you're interested, check it out. Also, I would encourage you, if you can, become a member, because some of the services that we're offering, that we will be offering, are more geared towards members. We're trying to sort of make some possibilities available to you. We're going to work with a number, or we have been working with a number of companies that also are interested in looking at some of the phenomenon that are related to, I say, the broader context, human excellence. And that's sort of what we're looking at, human excellence in the organizing context, and how does a concept like dignity work on that front? How do other potential concepts like mindfulness maybe work? How does the spiritual kind of experience connect to this? In what way? And in what way is it potentially distractive? So we want to keep ourselves honest as scholars. We want to keep ourselves also give ourselves opportunities to do serious research. And the ultimate game here is to become much more mainstream. And we have a number of relevant people that are helping us with that. So the next conversation is Henry Mintzberg, on, what is it? It's October 26th, I believe, or October 22nd, who's going to come on to discuss his perspectives. Then we have Otto Sharma in November. And we're currently also scheduling a faculty development workshop with Sandra and Jerry Davis, who's the former editor of ASQ. And so we have a number of bigwigs that are supportive to what we're doing, and Jim Walsh and others as well. So become a member, then we can sort of make these things more available. That's the plug. But also feel free to reach out to David, myself, and others if you want to be part of this community and build something together. So thanks again, David, for doing this. Thanks, Sandra. Thanks, Manuel. Thanks, Jared. Thanks.
Thank you, Manuel. Thank you, Sandra. And Sophia, Jared, nice job. Really appreciate it. And I'll be in touch actually later and follow up with you.
Perfect. Thanks so much.
All right. Thank you, everyone. We will see you soon.